You're listening to the Hello World Podcast number 25. My name is Sean Wildemuth and I am your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Jon Flanders and I have been in the same circles for quite a long time. We both spent time at Develop Mentor. We're now both authors at Pluralsight, and we've been showing up at the same conferences to talk about .NET for a long time. Jon is the author of RESTful.NET from O'Reilly, as well as Essential ASP from Madison Wesley. He's also the co-author of Mastering Visual Studio.NET for O'Reilly. These days, Jon is spending most of his time digging into iOS and helping companies develop applications for the iPhone and the iPad. Jon and I talked today about how becoming a lawyer first and then a developer second really changed the way he did software development. We dig into a little of our history around Develop Mentor as well, and our experience at Pluralsight. I think you'll enjoy this show. Let's take a listen. So I'm delighted to have my friend Jon Flanders on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Sean. How are you?
I'm assuming it's really sunny in California today.
It is sunny in California, as it is on most days. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you guys only get, 352 days of sun? Is that correct?
Something like that. Something like that.
Yeah. Poor guys.
Yep. Well, sometimes it is a little bit... we have this thing called the marine effect, which kind of makes it look cloudy in the morning or foggy, but then it's usually gone in the afternoon. So
that's funny.
We somehow live through that.
You do. You know, one of my favorite things about Anchorman was the not so subtle joke about the easiest job in the world was being a weatherman in San Diego.
Yes, the weather is quite hilarious.
So, obviously, you're on this podcast, so we're not interested in what you're doing today. We're interested in how you got started. So how did you have that typical first computer when you were growing up in Minnesota, or?
I did. So, when I was growing up in Minnesota let's see, what grade was I in? I think I was in 5th grade when I met two people who would continue to be important in my life. One was my friend, whose name is Peter Clark. Peter had an Apple II, and he went on to get a degree in computer science. He went on to work for Sun for a while, worked on an object-oriented database for Sun, and he worked a lot in Objective-C in the 90s using web objects and working on the Next platform. He was the first person I knew that had a Next, which was really awesome. And the other person was somebody that you're good friends with as well, Chris Sells.
Yep.
So Chris and Peter and I and another fellow who didn't end up going into tech at all. He was kind of just the other guy in our group. All were into computers, right? We were very much into programming computers and playing with computers, whether it was at school or a friend's house. And my first computer was a VIC-20.
Oh, nice. Same as mine, actually.
Yeah.
So you learned that wonderful Commodore Basic. Was that the first language you learned?
Commodore Basic was the first language I learned. And the first program I ever wrote was a D&D character generator.
There's a very common theme. I hear that a lot as the first.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was on a tape drive, right? I didn't have if I remember correctly, the hard drives you could buy for the VIC-20 at the time were $10,000.
They were crazy. I don't remember how much, but I started with a tape drive for the same reason.
Yeah. The Peter, not to say anything bad about him, he couldn't help that his father was a doctor and lived in the richer part of town. But across the street from Peter, who was another, I think he was a doctor as well. I don't remember, but he had a VIC-20 and he had a tape drive, and he actually let us come over, not a tape drive, but a hard drive.
Wow.
He let us come over and touch it and look at it and stuff. And it was pretty incredible at that time. But
hard drive or a floppy drive?
No, hard drive. He paid $10,000.
Hard drive. That is crazy.
Drive. Yep.
I didn't see a hard drive ever hooked up to a Commodore machine.
Yep, he had one. I remember seeing it.
That is crazy.
Yeah, so that is how I got my start early in the world of computing.
And was it a passion? Were you staying up late and being a hermit in your room when you weren't gathering with your cabal of other programmers?
Yes, it was a passion for a while. And I also, like many programmers, as is true for you as well, also became very interested in music.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a trumpet player. So I probably sort of, always had the ability to work with computers, and they all made sense to me. But I didn't really do a lot of programming again. I went into thinking I was going to be a professional trumpet player.
Nice.
I went to college, and somehow I just lost my mojo for being a musician somehow in college.
Maybe someone can explain to you, how many people actually made a decent living as a trumpet player. That's what happened to me.
Yeah, I think it was actually my girlfriend's mother that did that, which is a really sad story.
It sounds sad. We're not about sad.
Yeah, so we'll talk about happy. So then I didn't know what to do with myself. So somebody suggested I go to law school, and I thought,
interesting.
Okay, well, that seems like I'm pretty good at being logical, and I'm pretty good at arguing with people.
That's true.
Give it a spin. So I really loved law school. When I got out of law school, it wasn't a great time to be hired as a lawyer, and I was lucky to get a job at a company called West Publishing, which was a company that had a large legal database called Westlaw. They're now owned by Thomson Publishing, which is an even bigger company. Not many people have heard of Westlaw, but a lot of people have heard of LexisNexis. So it's a big, huge online database. It was run on 50 huge IBM mainframes.
Wow.
They were actually totally redundant. There was two sets. There was one set in the building and another set outside of the building in a bunker. And the bunker could withstand not a nuclear blast, but an airplane falling on it, because the building happened to be in the flight pattern of the Minneapolis airport.
Wow.
So it was pretty big technology. And, it's funny how everybody, talks about search and search on the web. But boy, the search engine that thing had or has, and I assume they've improved it, was amazing. You could do things like this word within a paragraph of this word, but not that word, or you could do within 5 words of, and it had a really powerful natural language searching engine as well.
Wow.
A lot of the big PhDs in search, natural language search work there. And I've never seen anything out in the wild on the internet that comes anywhere close to the technology that those two companies have, West Publishing and LexisNexis.
And that's so crucial to what they do. I mean, every minute a lawyer wastes trying to search for, the appropriate, legal precedent is, fees, which they don't mind, but at some point.
Well, they don't mind the fees, but they mind paying Westlaw for the amount of money that Westlaw costs, which was my job. My job was to answer the phone and talk to lawyers who needed help searching Westlaw.
Oh, nice.
So I learned the query language, and I knew all the different databases, and I knew all the tips and tricks to find things easy and quickly. And so I would walk lawyers through, how do you find this case the most quick way so I can spend the least amount of time on Westlaw?
Wow.
So I did that for a couple of years, and we had a number of products. We had, at that time, they were coming out with CD-ROM libraries of cases and statutes, and they had a Mac version, and I had a Mac at home. So I got the Mac version and took it home and played with it so that I could support the Mac version. And then I started talking to the Mac programmer at West Publishing, and I started talking to him about programming. And I really decided that because apologies to anybody who has a lawyer in their family, but lawyers are kind of assholes. And being a lawyer really isn't very much fun. Going to law school is a lot of fun. Law school is a lot of learning and a lot of reading and a lot of smart thinking. Being a lawyer is mostly just pushing paper around and talking to clients. There are very few jobs in law that are really, intellectually challenging in any way. Being a judge, being a law professor, maybe, but very few other ones. So I decided, you know what, I don't really like this law thing. I'm going to become a programmer. And I bought myself C++ for Dummies and started learning C++. And my actual first non-basic program was for Novell had a mail client, and I can't even remember the name of it. Groupwise.
There it is. Yeah.
Yep. And I wrote a macro for Groupwise to encrypt emails.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So I could send emails back and forth to other people on my team, encrypted, and we'd have to have a shared key, obviously.
Sure.
But that was my next real program. And then I ended up writing a bunch of macros to do very common operations that we did in the department. And the problem was that West Publishing seemed like a great place for a lawyer who wants to be a programmer to be, but they were in the middle of selling themselves to this company. So there was a complete hiring freeze from about 3 months after I got there to when I left. And so I couldn't get a job. I couldn't even move to another job within my same division.
So you were stuck on the phones, whereas you preferred to be writing code.
I wanted to write code. So I got a job at the University of Minnesota, and it was only partly writing code and partly doing computer support, but it allowed me to take classes. So then I started taking for free the beginning CSI courses.
Oh, nice.
And so from then I got a job doing ASP programming. And then because I knew Chris, I started hanging out on the DCOM mailing list and the ATL mailing list, and I started answering questions. And it was at that point that he was working for Developmentor, and that was like one of the top recruiting tools for Developmentor was to look for people answering questions.
Sure.
Plus, I knew Chris, so I was like a double winner in that way. So I went to work for Developmentor and never finished. I was going to get a computer science minor, but I never finished that. I just took off, went to work for Developmentor in Don Box with Chris. And
is that when you moved to California, or were you doing all that remote from Minnesota?
I did that remote from Minnesota. I didn't move to California until much later.
Oh, okay.
But I did start coming to California from that, and that's when I first discovered that I loved palm trees and warm weather.
Well, I think when living through, 25 or 30 Minnesota winters would make anybody love palm trees.
Yes. They are dastardly. I know you grew up in Boston. And
no, I grew up in Miami, which is why I detest palm trees.
You detest palm trees.
Yeah.
But you spent time in Boston, right?
I did.
So you know about bad winters.
Yeah, I don't think they're nearly as bad as they are in Minnesota. We don't have engine heaters.
No, and you don't ever take a bag of charcoal that you buy at the 7-Eleven and start it on fire under your oil pan when you don't have a heater.
Exactly.
Which is what a lot of people in Minnesota used to do.
That doesn't sound dangerous at all.
It's not dangerous. No, not at all.
That's funny. So, you were at Developmentor quite a while. And you were teaching as well as developing courses there, right?
Yep. I developed courses there and I did teaching. And for a while, I actually ran the website and all the internal applications.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know you did that.
Yeah.
Actually, that now sounds familiar. I worked for people on the podcast who don't know, I worked for Developmentor for about a year, but it was in such this weird little arm in Portland that I didn't have a lot of visibility into what was going on, an HQ, as it were.
No, and I think, weren't you the one who shut down the lights? You were the last Gen X employee?
Yeah, I was a true believer on Gen X. I really believed in what we were doing. And
it was great. It
was heartbreaking to,
I loved it.
It was the last time I cared.
Yeah, I evangelized it to people in the office. People in the office didn't really understand what it was. And I would do seminars on it in the office to show people what it was and how you could use it.
And now we take code generation, for granted in a lot of ways.
Sure, absolutely.
It was just, it felt like it was more about preaching the merits of it than it was preaching the merits of the product. It was, unique code gen, not we're a good code generator, right? And so, as most things in technology, timing ends up being important.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so did you have this passion for teaching before you came Developmentor, or did it really sprout there? Because I've taken your courses. I have your some of your early books, and there's an obvious passion for sharing information with people, and I wonder where that started.
Yeah, I don't know where that started. And what's really weird is historically, as a person, I've always been very introverted.
Mm-hmm.
But getting up in front of a bunch of people who are technical people, is not quite the same as getting up in front of a group of, random people off the street. Although, I mean, of course, now after so many years, I probably am comfortable with that too.
Sure.
But I think the thing for me about teaching was, and I think maybe Chris embedded this in my head somewhere, is that he said, you will never learn anything better than if you have to teach it to somebody else. Yeah. And I still find that very true today. Any technology that I touch on, if I look at it, I understand it and I can play with it and sort of figure it out. But then when I sit down and start to have to think about, okay, how am I going to explain this to somebody else? Right? What is the story of this technology? Why do I care? What's my motivation? And how do I learn? Once I'm motivated, how do I learn that? And I think that was the thing that excited me, the idea of learning things really, really well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, like when I talked about law school, I really like law school because, we'd read like 5,000 pages of cases a day sometimes.
Wow.
For 3 or 4 different topics. And you had to be able to look at those things and figure out what the right important points were, because if you go to class, the instructor could call on you.
Yeah.
Right. And
I've seen the paper chase.
Yes, you've seen the law school Socratic method. So for me, that was really cool to be able to learn things to that level, and then to be able to. I really enjoy when we don't get this. You and I don't get this very much because we don't teach in person very often anymore. We mostly teach online.
Yeah.
But I really love when you're teaching in person and you see somebody get that aha moment.
Yeah, that's crucial.
And you see them get it, and then it's just such a great feeling to know that you have, somehow sparked something in somebody's mind, to figure out how to do their job better. It's just really cool.
And you can see the wrinkles leave the forehead, and you're like, oh, okay.
Right. Yep.
They went from confusion to understanding. And that is, that's why I sort of stayed in it probably longer than I should have, face-to-face training, is because I really enjoyed that. A lot of the contemporaries for in the XAML space that we're teaching had gone to online training, not the Pluralsight canned training that I've been doing a lot lately, but get a bunch of windows open to students or to
right.
do it without being able to see the students. And it's the most excruciating thing I've ever done. I just won't do it anymore because it's too painful to not be able to see whether the students are getting it or not. I'm just, talking into dead space.
Yep.
Very hard.
Yep. And that's kind of what hard about doing the kind of training we do now for Pluralsight. But I think you just have to kind of take that mindset that, we hope that how we're distilling those points down really do the sort of aha moments, right?
Let's hope. Yeah, let's hope. So you made sort of when you were a developmentor, you were focused on a lot of Microsoft technologies. And in the last few years, you've sort of made this transition, not sort of, but made a big transition into iOS and some of the others. Was that a conscious decision, or is that just where you saw the market going? What sort of prompted that, or were you just bored?
I don't know that I was bored. I mean, Microsoft is still coming out with new technologies that are not boring. It was a two-pronged thing. Certainly, looking at the mobile space and thinking, boy, if we're not in the mobile space, somehow in the next 5 to 10 years, we're just not going to be in computing at all.
Right.
I mean, that's fairly clear. But the other thing was, honestly, I got tired of, I think you're still an MVP, right? Are you still a Microsoft MVP? I was an MVP, and it's one of those things where they talk about you don't want to ever see how the sausage is made. But it was more than that. It was the being an MVP and getting a look at new things and having groups try to sort of say to you, oh, you should really be into this new thing, and then having them be canceled.
Yeah.
And I think the one that really broke my back, or broke the straw that broke the camel's back, whatever that phrase is, was Oslo.
Oh, yeah.
And I got really excited about Oslo. I did public talks about Oslo. I talked about it at TechEd. I talked about it at VS Live. And then they just canceled the whole thing. And I just said, I had similar experiences with other technologies. BizTalk was one where it's still there, but they sort of let it stagnate for a number of years and didn't really do anything with it. And then Windows Workflow Foundation, which was another one that I jumped on, I thought was great. And so I kind of got tired of trying to figure out what was popular and just decided, you know what, I'm just going to pick something that's popular.
Well, I can understand that. When I was in the sort of the heat of Silverlight, and everyone was like, well, how did you know it was going to be big? I'm like, well, you have to go back and look at my track record. I picked every dead horse, object spaces and Oslo. And, there's a litany of dead Microsoft projects that I all wrote about or taught and so I can certainly see that piece. Does the way that you learn, is that different than you think ordinary programmers? Or is it just that, we have more time to learn, and so we have sort of a different take on it?
I think that the fact that we've done the kinds of things that you and I have done for so many years, and like I said, learning how to teach something to somebody else, I don't think that you can separate that. So I've been working pretty much actually full time at a company for the past 6 months or so. And I still apply the same way of learning and the way of thinking about things that I did when I was teaching or learning things for teaching as I do in the day to day. I think the only big difference is just process.
Sure.
Right. I mean, when you're doing a day to day project, you really have to enforce process. Whereas, this when you're deciding what to work on or working on a course, you can kind of have a lot of flexibility in the way you work.
Yeah.
And especially if you're not working on a team. And that's one of the things that I actually miss the most about. I realized that, like I was talking about that aha moment, you were talking about how you missed or hung on for a while to be able to get that in-person interaction.
Yeah.
I realized last summer I went to work for a company in Boston called Software Artisans.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you heard of them.
I have.
It's actually funny because 15 years ago, I sold them the component that was a C++ COM component to generate binary Excel files on the server.
Interesting.
And they basically turned that into a whole business, Dave Will, and then ended up selling that to Microsoft. Well, he decided to get into the iOS space, and he had a bunch of developers that weren't iOS developers. So I went out there for 3 weeks and basically brought them all up to speed. And I started to get that same feeling of when you work do the teaching, but working on a team. So that's why I really went to find a full-time job in iOS, was partly to establish myself as, yes, I have an iOS programming job on my resume.
Sure.
Because, I could tell everybody I can program iOS, but until you actually had that job, people tended to not really believe you.
Sure, because everyone at some point was saying that a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I really realized that the working with a team can actually, in many ways, have that same sort of feeling. And the other great thing is if you're working with a bunch of smart people, they can teach you things too, which happens sometimes in a instructor-led training class. You learn things either by a student asking a question you hadn't thought of before, or sometimes they'll teach you things.
Absolutely.
But working on a team can have that same effect. So that's why I decided to sort of pull back a little bit from the training independent contractor thing and actually go work on a team.
Well, it's interesting because, there are certainly times in my career now where I think, I miss that, not just the way you learn, but just the sense of building things in teams and working with the same people and watching people grow and having them help you grow to be a better person, or at least a better developer, maybe not a better person.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can help you with that, Sean.
No, I'm pretty much stuck. And that's sort of an interesting problem because, most developers out there, many that are listening, probably already work on teams. And when I talk to young developers, a lot of them seem really anxious to figure out how to get out of having a job and working for themselves or working from home. And it's not, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think once you get away from being in that environment and having the interaction with peers can really be a shock to a lot of developers.
Yeah. I think that, it's nice to have a mixture, I think it's nice to work at a place that will let you work at home in silence and really get coding done sometimes, but you just can't really beat that, that interaction and realizing how much more you can do with a team of people than by yourself.
Absolutely.
You and I have both tried to create products and put apps in app stores.
Yep.
And, they're not big products. They're, products that work, apps that work. But, you can do so much more and build things that are so much more significant if you have a team of people.
And I also think that the quality of the software goes up with up to a point with more developers. Sometimes when I was building my product, because I was building it, there are decisions that I look back now and went, I'm sure somebody would have called me out on the carpet and went, why are we making, why are we taking this shortcut, or why, there's a better way of doing this, because, the myopic view, especially when you're in the same code day after day, more eyes usually means better code. And I if I had the money to bankroll it, I would have, right? I would have hired a bunch of guys and let's do it.
Yep.
But it wasn't a big enough idea to throw a bunch of money at. It was the small, interesting ideas. And I think that's what happens with a lot of apps out there is the quality level of some apps are kind of low because it is these one man on the weekend shops that don't get a chance to sort of have that environment of development.
Yep, that's true. And then there's all the people out there who think that they are going to be the next, Mark Zuckerberg or
at least Flappy Bird. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been reading so many horror stories about venture capitalists and startups and how developers, especially in Silicon Valley, are just getting sort of run through the ringer from startup to startup with this hope that someday they're going to be part of the next Facebook. And it seems to me that that's another thing that young developers are really doing. Like you said, some are doing hey, I'd really like to get out on my own and be a single developer. But many are also just chasing this dream of, being the next Zuckerberg or whatever. I just don't think there's that many of those things that are going to happen.
There are, and there's no way to predict what it is, for, Facebook wasn't the first one to come up with this idea, right? Sure. And for some reason, for some good decisions and some amount of luck, it succeeded. So it doesn't even, it's not just the MySpaces that were in its wake. There were 100, Friendsters and,
yep.
That all had a lot of money and good ideas behind it that also failed for who knows what reason. And it actually reminds me of sports players in high school that all think they're going to make the NBA or NFL or whatever the team is. And it, yep. it just filters out to the numbers are so small. And I think in tech, it's even smaller because there are, there's 20 guys every decade that make it instead of 100 guys every year.
Yep. And unlike the NBA sports analogy, though, I would add one difference, I think, is that generally speaking, the best players do end up being in the NBA or NFL or Major League Baseball. It's not always the best developers who end up on that star team.
Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. I think that's exactly on the money. Exactly on the money. So during your career as you were coming up, what was your experience with mentoring, both mentoring other people and being mentored? What were you learning that was making you a better developer day to day?
Well, what I found was typically in when I was developing before I went to work for Develop Mentor, I tended to get hired at a lower level than what I thought I should be hired at. But then I would typically jump and leap over the other people that I worked with.
Sure.
Sometimes that was okay with those people, and sometimes it wasn't. But so I tended to be in the mentor category of, like I said, I've always been a fast learner, and but then working at Develop Mentor, obviously worked with people like Don Box, who, I will never be as smart as Don Box, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But he has been a mentor to me, and Chris has been a mentor to me. So that's really one of the best situations to be in, is where, you can be in a situation with a bunch of really smart people. Actually, I think my father-in-law says this. I'm sure he didn't come up with the quote, but if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Oh, right.
You should be in a room where people can challenge you. And that doesn't mean that you won't ever teach them anything, because
of course
I've taught Don Box things. I know I have. It's very satisfying when you know something that a Don Box, for example, doesn't know. But having that experience of being sort of the mentee in some ways, but then a mentor in other ways. So I think for me, it's been sort of a I don't know if I'd say 50-50, but
sure.
Either way. And that again is the kind of thing that we were just talking about, like working on a team where you can teach other people things and then they can teach you things. And so it's nice to have a working environment where you've got as many smart people as you can, and you can have as much of that going back and forth as possible.
So that brings me to a sort of a curious question. When I went to Develop Mentor, it was a big emotional risk. I was afraid to not be the smartest guy in the room. I'd spent the early parts of my career sort of relishing that role in very small pond, obviously, but I was always the go-to guy, and I knew when I was going to Develop Mentor that wasn't going to be the case. I knew that, right. I was going to be lifted up by smarter people, but at the same time, I wasn't going to be. I was never going to be the guy. I was never going to be smarter than Don and Chris and and certainly Tim. So when you went to a place where you weren't the smartest guy in the room, was that just part of your nature, or was that a risk for you as well?
Yeah, I think that was part of my nature. I mean, I don't remember feeling like it was a risk. And maybe the thing that it connects me back to is law school, where, I would be, not all my professors were the most awesome people in the world, but boy, did they know a lot of stuff.
Sure.
I mean, they were very, very, capable lawyers and incredibly large breadth of knowledge. And I think maybe having been in that academic setting, in such an intense academic setting for 3 years, and with people around me who were really smart too, right?
Sure.
I mean, certainly it was, there was a bit of competition about who was the smartest and who answered the questions best and blah, blah, blah. And so I think maybe that environment really prepared me for walking into the Develop Mentor environment without feeling like
you had to be that.
Yeah. I was worried when I walked in front of a class that, everybody has performance anxiety. So for me, walking in front of a class and feeling like, oh, I wonder if anybody's going to know this subject better than me in the class. That was the fear for me, right? Is not in the company, but when I would go out and work for the company, that somebody would be, the expert. And luckily I don't think that ever happened.
In somewhat in the same vein, my early fear in teaching was that they would ask me a question I wouldn't know. And it took me quite a while to figure out that that's okay. That being able to help, them find the question, I didn't have to have it right on the, right off the top of my head every time. I mean, certainly the basics you need to have with the material you're teaching, you need to understand. But when they ask, a question out of left field, I don't have to be the one that knows everything about everything that moment.
Yeah.
Knowing where the answer is good enough when I taught, but I was just, always fearful because there's always, I shouldn't say always, but there's often that one student in a class who wants to still be the, be the star student and impress everybody with their own knowledge they're bringing in.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing for me in that vein was always my I don't know if it's ability or I mean, I was always willing to make a fool of myself by writing code that didn't work.
Sure.
And then, so somebody, oftentimes in those situations you're talking about, I'd say, I don't know, let's write it, just see if we can figure it out.
Yeah.
And figuring it out with the class and having things not work and then figuring out how to make them work. I thought those were some of the best teaching moments.
Absolutely.
And then, once you have that under your belt, then of course, the next time you teach, you generally are going to use that up front,
Yeah.
Unless it was a very obscure thing. But, that in some ways, that's the best interaction. But yeah, being able to say that you don't know and then, but making sure that you answer the question, right? At some point, sometimes it was hey, I'll have to ask somebody else or I'll have to look it up or, of course, nowadays with Google, probably everybody looks it up at the same time, right? And answers it in the class.
Yeah. I found it. Yeah. That whole thing.
I mean, that was the thing about Developmentor in those days. If you wanted the knowledge that we had at Developmentor, there was no place to get it other than coming to our courses.
No.
Right. And now, whatever calm exception that you have, you just Google it and some random person answers it on Stack Overflow or on their blog. And you never know who that person is. Right. I'm not sure that a Donbox like character could exist in today's world because of the ubiquity of the information.
Yeah. Yeah. Because teaching has become less about knowledge and more about ideas than I think it used to be.
Yeah.
The why versus the how.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So where at your new job, are you helping lead teams or is this more of a teaching opportunity?
Well, the job that I've been working at for about 6 months, I actually am now not at that job. And mostly it was because they kept saying they were going to let me build a team and it just never materialized.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So
I'm looking for other opportunities right now.
Oh, nice.
Anybody listen to the podcast needs an iOS developer, give me a call. So right now I'm sort of in a space where I'm going to be doing some more, plural site courses and, like I said, maybe looking for another job.
Nice.
We'll see what happens.
Nice. Well, it's been great having you on the show. Now I've officially had a lawyer on the show, and so I can tick that check mark off.
Oh yeah, that's an important checkbox.
It is.